Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Spratt from Sports Info Solutions, and I'm joined, as always, by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. The bulk of today's show is going to be covering the 4 playoff games we have this upcoming weekend, but I want to get started with some other news unrelated to the playoff games because apparently everything's happening in the NFL right now. To start with, Aaron, let's talk about a couple of head coaching hires that came down in the last couple of days, with the Broncos hiring Dolphins defensive coordinator Vance Joseph as their new head coach, and the Bills hiring Panthers defensive coordinator Sean McDermott as their head coach. You know, Greg Thomas has filled in a number of times for me on the show as a big Dolphins fan. I'm obviously a big Panthers fan, so the two of us are a bit miffed that we're losing important coaches on our team. But I wanted to ask you whether you had any strong opinions about either of these hires as good moves for their teams or anything along those lines.
Well, I think the first thing to remember about head coaching jobs is that it's not about scheming. I mean, certainly there are some head coaches who bring their scheme to that side of the ball and who participate in that weekly. But for the most part, head coach is more of a CEO position. It's about player management and management of the coaches under you. And so whether or not a coach did well scheming in a certain season is not necessarily the best indicator of how well he'll be a head coach. I mean, that's why you end up with guys who are really good coordinators and not good head coaches, like Wade Phillips and Norv Turner. So, I mean, that's the sort of framework in which I see the Vance Joseph thing. People have talked about Vance Joseph for a couple of years now as a really strong head coaching candidate, and I know some people who've worked with him and speak of him very, very highly. So I know that the Miami defense wasn't exactly great this year, and they faded late, but he did really well when he was the secondary coach for Houston and Cincinnati. And the fact is that given the talent on the Miami defense, you know, at linebacker, it's sort of nobody except for a guy who was good 4 years ago before he blew out his knee. I think that, you know, Joseph did all right this year, but, you know, he's sort of prized for his managerial skills more than scheming. The problem with the hire of Joseph is that it means probably the departure of Wade Phillips, and Wade Phillips is the best defensive coordinator in the league, and you don't want him to leave.
You know, what you were saying there about Joseph with the Dolphins, though, I think is kind of a big point here, where, you know, the players themselves probably have a lot to do with these coaches' successes. And I really don't know whether McDermott was a good defensive coordinator for the Panthers. I feel like it's hard to know because they've been a talented team under him, and, you know, Rivera himself has been a defensive-minded coach in his career. So,
I mean, again, I don't know much about him now. I mean, I said I've known people who've worked with Joseph. I don't know people who've worked with McDermott. So I haven't, you know, heard any firsthand whether they think he's really good or bad. I think the preeminent story that's coming out about this is that it's a real reversal from Rex Ryan as far as, you know, being detail-oriented versus sort of bombastic, you know, the kind of Ryan style. So, you know, maybe that's good for Buffalo. I really don't know what we're going to get out of him. It's hard to know whether that's a particularly, it doesn't stand out to me as a particularly good or bad hire. I mean, it's not a retread.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is just that McDermott is so understated, which you're right. It's the total opposite in terms of personality from what Rex Ryan was. I'll be interested to see, because my suspicion at least is that McDermott is somebody who is more willing to adjust his play calling and style and everything based on the talent on the field. And the one charting stat that I have on this is that the Panthers blitzed 186 times this season, which was the middle of the pack, 16th in football. So it's not like he was doing anything particularly, you know, outlandish, outlierish, anything along those lines. But I'll be interested to see what he does with the Bills. I think he,
as opposed to Todd Bowles, where wherever Todd Bowles goes, they will blitz a lot. Yeah. Like, that's his thing. That's what they'll do wherever he goes.
I'm pretty sure the Jets were the number one team in blitzing this season. But anyway, the other bit of news that we can talk a little bit about is, I think it just pretty much came down over the last day, that the Chargers are going to be moving to Los Angeles next season. You have any thoughts about this, Aaron?
Yes, nobody wins. Nobody wins. There's no point in this at all. There's no point. You know, growing up in Orange County as a kid, I was a Rams fan as a kid before I moved to Boston. And there were plenty of Rams fans and plenty of Raiders fans. And when those teams left, they left behind lots of fans. They didn't leave behind Chargers fans. I don't really know a lot of people in Los Angeles. I wouldn't think a lot of people in Los Angeles are rooting for the Chargers. And if the question is, people in LA need a team to root for, no, they don't. They just got the Rams. They don't need two. I've said for years that I thought that the idea that the LA market wouldn't support teams because the Raiders and Rams left in the same year was ridiculous. But it doesn't mean that they're going to support two teams. And I realized that Spanos just seems to just kind of be angry that they wouldn't pay taxpayer money for a stadium in San Diego, because I got to think he would make more money in San Diego if he built his own stadium than in LA, being a tenant of the Rams, where the Rams get most of the money and have had not a 1-year lead on getting the fans. They've had a 50-year lead on getting the fans because of all the Rams fans that are Rams fans from before they moved to St. Louis, and we're waiting for them to come back for years. I feel like the San Diego thing is, how did we end up in this place? It doesn't make sense. It would make more sense for the Raiders to move to LA and the Chargers to move to Las Vegas. It would make more sense for the Chargers to stay in San Diego. It would make more sense for the Chargers to move to Oregon. It would make more sense for the Chargers to move to Austin, Texas. This doesn't make sense to me.
Well, it's definitely a mystery to me. But really,
and the new logo is horrific.
Yeah, we were just talking about that before the show. It's in LA with a little lightning bolt at the end of the script. So everyone check that out and look forward to it. But we should probably get started talking about these playoff games before we chat all day about these things. Like last week, let's just go through these in the order that they're going to be on the air, so we can start with the Seahawks and the Falcons. In the Seahawks playoff win over the Lions this week, they won 26-6. I feel like there's a public perception that the Seahawks recaptured their identity, quote unquote. In particular, that's tied into the fact that Thomas Rawls rushed for 161 yards with 6.0 yards per carry. Aaron, do you buy into that narrative that the Seahawks sort of found themselves, or do you think this was really more about the matchup?
Matchup, totally about the matchup. And boy, do I feel like a dumbass for not taking Thomas Rawls in the last round of the staff playoff fantasy league, knowing that Detroit has a bad run defense, and that, guess who else has a bad run defense? The Atlanta Falcons. Yeah. They ranked 29th in DVOA run defense this year. So, listen, Rawls will always break tackles. He's fabulous at that. But the big holes that he got were a product of Detroit's poor run defense, especially with their front four. And I think you're going to see something similar this week with Atlanta. I think Seattle is going to get plenty of ground game going. But if they had to face, there's other teams that if they faced like Dallas, for example, where the run defense is much stronger than the pass defense, it wouldn't be like this.
That's really interesting that it may be a good matchup for Seattle's offense, because I have some questions about Atlanta's offense against Seattle from the other side of it. So let me build up to that a little bit. Last week when we were talking about the Lions and what sort of signs of optimism you might have for them, the one thing that we really came up with was that the Lions spread the ball around to a lot of different receivers, which is something that might work against the Seahawks as they're currently constructed, because Earl Thomas is out. You have sort of the number one cornerback in Richard Sherman, but maybe they don't have the depth in the secondary that we're accustomed to seeing. That didn't really play out with the Lions themselves, but what are your thoughts about Atlanta's offensive strategy facing this defense? At least in my mind, don't they have like a primary receiver guy in Julio Jones, or you think they're able to spread the ball around enough to maybe take advantage of the weakened secondary of the Seahawks?
Yeah, Julio's obviously the number one weapon, but they spread the ball around really well. What's the record? Ryan apparently set a record this year, throwing touchdowns to 13 different receivers.
Wow.
He actually had better numbers throwing to other receivers than he did to Julio Jones. Sanu was good. Austin Hooper, the rookie tight end, was number 2 in DVOA among tight ends with at least 25 targets. Now, he had 27 targets, so he's just over the minimum. Let's not get too crazy here.
Right.
But that's a weapon that they can use. Obviously, the running backs are both really good in the passing game. And when you go back and you look at the first matchup that Seattle won 26-24, The Falcons, Julio Jones still had 139 yards on 7 catches, even though looking at the charting, it mostly looks like Sherman moved around to cover him. Seattle normally, right, they do cornerbacks on signs, but they moved Sherman around. That's why you ended up with Sherman and Julio Jones on that last play, the controversial non-DPI call.
Yeah, I remember that.
Oh, they didn't call pass interference. So, even having Sherman cover Julio Jones close didn't slow Julio down, and it certainly didn't slow everyone else down. So when you combine that with the decline of the Seattle defense over the last few weeks, I think things look really ripe for both of these offenses to have a huge game this week.
The one thing that stood out to me, though, in that matchup in Week 6 between these two teams was that Atlanta had trouble running the ball. Devontae Freeman and Tevin Coleman combined for just 50 yards on 17 carries. Is that sort of typical of what Seattle does defensively? They're the number 10 overall defensive team in DVOA, but do they have like a strong split towards stopping the run versus stopping the pass?
Yeah, I mean, it's in particular since the Thomas injury. So over the season, right, so Seattle was one of the 12 best run defense DVOAs in history this year.
Wow.
And against the pass, they were 13th. And when you look at the with and without Earl Thomas, the pass defense collapsed and the run defense basically stayed roughly the same. So I think the place where Freeman and Coleman do damage in this game is as receivers, not as runners. Seattle is still a really strong run defense.
Well, I mean, I think that game and then 2 other games that we're going to get to in a bit are going to be really interesting matchups that I'm looking forward to watching. The one game that may not be quite as evenly matched is your Patriots against the Texans. Now, the Texans actually look pretty good in beating the Connor Cook-led Raiders, for whatever that's worth. And something that I noticed when I was watching the game was the announcers kept harping on the fact that the Texans had the best defense in football. And what I think they were referring to was the fact that the Texans allowed the fewest total yards on defense.
Oh, God.
The end-of-season DVOA ratings had the Texans as the 7th best defense. So could you explain a little bit about why those two numbers weren't completely in sync?
Sure. Would you like to guess which defense in the NFL this year faced the fewest number of plays?
Oh, interesting. I'm going to guess the Texans.
You are correct.
Gosh, I'm good. Amazing.
950 offensive plays. So, the funny thing is, so Houston actually played a hard schedule of opposing offenses. Their defensive schedule ranks 6th in the league this year, as opposed to the Patriots' defensive schedule, which was dead last. All of the really bad quarterbacks, and that doesn't even account for the fact that Roethlisberger was injured in the game that the Steelers played against the Patriots. So it's not a question of opponent adjustment for Houston. It's just about number of plays. The other thing is turnovers. So they allowed 5.1 yards per play. That's 5th in the NFL. So the difference between DVOA and yards per play is basically turnovers, because they were below average on turnovers. And I would love to give you the number, but I just closed my Pro Football Reference webpage because you may have just heard a little bit of noise coming from my side of the computer. They're having a small advertising problem today. So I can't give you the exact turnover number for Houston, but it is below average. It's something like 19 turnovers compared to a league average of 23, if I'm remembering correctly. And I know that they don't have a particularly odd fumble recovery rate. So it's the low number of plays and the low number of turnovers. I mean, this is a good defense. Don't get me wrong. And a really underrated secondary, especially A.J. Boye, was really good this year. But they're not the number 1 defense in the league. And, of course, neither are the Patriots, right? So other people will say the Patriots are the number 1 defense in the league because they allowed the fewest points per game. And that's really absurd, because you have to. It's based on the idea that field position is fluid, and not everything that creates points is offense, and not everything that prevents points is defense. The Patriots were number 1 in points allowed because, 1, they played the easiest schedule in the league of opposing offenses, and 2, they have great special teams. especially kickoffs and punts. The returns were not great, but the kickoffs and punts were great. When I say great special teams, I mean kickoffs and punts. So they constantly were facing opponents who had long fields. Also, they never turned the ball over because Brady never threw interceptions. And when he did, they were deep passes, which is another thing that meant that opponents faced very long fields, which meant that they weren't going to score. So the Patriots were not the best defense in the league. Neither were the Texans. The Texans have a better defense than the Patriots. Both defenses have played better in the second half of the season. The difference is the offenses, where I don't even need to say anything because everybody knows.
I want to follow up on one point that you said about how the Texans faced the fewest number of plays in the league. Is that about the tempo? Like, is there some property of their defense that's like restricting how quickly teams are moving? Or is tempo typically dictated by offenses and maybe it just was a scheduling quirk? Or do you have any thoughts about why that is? And is that something that they could maybe reduce the number of plays the Patriots run against them to try to keep the game low scoring?
Well, I think that a lot of it does have to do with the mindset and the philosophy of the offenses that you face. But also, if you're, if you're a losing team, and they're not a losing team this year, but it was a lot of close games that, you're not necessarily hurrying things up. They faced an above average number of drives on defense. Houston faced 183 defensive drives. The average was 177. So, but they faced the fewest number of plays per drive at 5.3. I think their defense was good at getting off the field and good at, getting 3 and outs, and it's just not spectacular. It's a good defense.
Yeah. I'm seeing that same split in the charting data as well. I looked up, I think just because how great Jadeveon Clowney was and the defensive line was in the Raiders game itself. And remember that for the season, the Raiders offensive line was actually the one that limited pressure the most of any offensive line. But for the full season, the Texans were actually pretty much middle of the pack in defensive pressure rate. So it's not like they were overwhelming like they may have been in this one playoff game.
Yeah, Clowney was really good against the run this year. That was sort of part of the Clowney breakout season, is the quality against the run, not just pass pressure. So, and they do have other guys to bring pass pressure. There's Whitney Merciless, but they're not an above average pass rush team. What they do have is a really underrated secondary, right? With not just Bowie, but a Jonathan Joseph. Mm-hmm. And I believe they also have a strong run defense. It was 17th for the year, but it was 10th over the second half of the season, their run defense. It was 27th for the first half of the season.
So we've talked a lot about how this is the year of no great teams. But something that you wrote about in your final season DVOA column was that the Patriots may have become the one great team in the league by the end of the season. They were number one in overall DVOA for the year at 25.3%. But I think something that's a little bit more telling is that in weighted DVOA, they were up at 34%. And just because of coincidence or whatever the case may be, all of the early season games without Tom Brady fall out of the weighted DVOA. So clearly they were a much better team with Brady at the helm, not surprisingly.
Right.
I'm kind of getting to the question of, is it pretty much normal that the Patriots finish number one in DVOA this season? Have they been doing that just all the time with Belichick as their head coach?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that the Patriots being better in the second half of the season is not just about Brady. So that's the part we knew, right? Like all season long we knew, okay, discount the offense in the first 4 games. But the defense has also gotten better in the second half of the season. Whether you want to say that's because they traded Jamie Collins, I doubt it. Because they adapted to the fact that they traded Jamie Collins, more likely. But they were 18th in defensive DVOA over the first half of the season. They were 8th over the second half of the season. So the defense has improved, and not the run defense has been strong all year. It's the pass defense that has improved. The Patriots were 25th in pass defense through week 9. They are 14th in pass defense from week 10 to 17. The other thing that improved is the special teams, because one, Stephen Gostkowski got over his case of the yips that he had early on. Yeah. And the other is that they stopped putting Cyrus Jones back there to muff punts and kickoffs. So that made things a little bit better. The the Patriots do not finish number one every year. It's sort of interesting. They've only been number one for the year 3 times in DVOA history, and that is 2007, 2010, which was a really big, what is not remembered as one of the great upsets in playoff history, but should be. The 2010 Patriots were dominant, 14-2 going into the playoffs with 44% DVOA, and they lost to a Jets team at home, to a Jets team that they had beaten like 45-3 a few weeks before. Yeah. It is really one of the great playoff upsets in NFL history, and even though it was only 6 years ago, nobody talks about it. But those are the only other years that the Patriots were number one. But the thing is, they're always in the top 5. Like, here are the Patriots' ranks in total DVOA going back each year. This year, right, they were first. Last year, 6th. 4th, 5th, 3rd, 1st, 4th, 9th in the Matt Castle year. 1st, 3rd, 12th in 2005. That was the year that I said Bill Belichick had no magic beans.
Right.
And that the Patriots were no longer good enough to beat Denver, and so they didn't. And then 2nd, 4th, 7th, and then 11th in their first Super Bowl season. So that is every year since 2001, the Patriots have been in the top dozen in DVOA, and they've been in the top 6 every year since 2009.
That also has them in the top 10 in offensive DVOA for 13 straight years. And
yep.
The one that's most
including
amazing
the Matt Castle year.
Right, that's right. The one that's most amazing to me is they've been in the top 16 in special teams for 21 consecutive years. That actually reaches back before Belichick was even there. So
that reaches back before Pete Carroll was even there.
That's insane to me. And it's also, by the way, another advantage the Patriots have over Houston, who we mentioned last week.
Huge advantage over Houston.
The worst team, yeah. Special teams DVOA team. As a quick aside, do you have any concerns at all about the Patriots handling the Texans this week?
No, it would be what I just said about the Jets in 2010. This would probably be a bigger upset than that.
Yeah, that's how I feel. So we should probably go ahead and move on to the Steelers and Chiefs, which I think is actually probably my most compelling matchup of this weekend. The Steelers, they didn't really have too much trouble with the Dolphins last week, and while Le'Veon Bell was his typical incredible self, I was most impressed by their defense that limited the Fins to 305 total yards and forced 3 turnovers. I think I've been a little bit skeptical of this team, this defense over the course of the season.
Are we all?
But they're up to number 5 in weighted defensive DVOA. So, Aaron, can you explain how this team has become such a good defensive team, even though I haven't really picked up on it myself watching the team?
No. I'm not sure either, actually. I'm sure Scott will write a lot about this for his playoff preview. He's doing Pittsburgh, Kansas City for our playoff previews on Friday. We're all doing the same team we did last week, so I'll do Dallas Green Bay. Pittsburgh, it really is like, I'm not sure. They're not really a strong pressure team. They're not a bad pressure team, but they're not a strong pressure team, right? They're 17th in pressure rate on defense.
Exactly.
The cornerbacks are all middle of the road in the charting stats, the charting metrics. Their divide by type of receiver is very odd. They are the worst defense in the league against number 1 receivers after you adjust for the quality of those receivers. But they are 3rd against 2s and 1 against 3s. But there's no clear split between left and right. They're better against short passes than against deep passes. But there's no clear, like, I don't think that's a certain cornerback, because otherwise we would see a difference in the cornerback charting metrics.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if it's a way that they use their safeties. There was a long period of time where the Patriots were always better against the number 1 than against the number 2 because of how they used the safety. And I wonder if with Pittsburgh it's sort of the opposite. But I don't know what causes this split. And I don't know who counts as the number 1 receiver in Kansas City. Is it Tyreek Hill, who's their most dangerous offensive weapon? Or is it Jeremy Maclin, who runs the routes that are more sort of associated classically with a number 1 receiver? Or is it Travis Kelce, who truly is their most dangerous receiving option, but is a tight end? And Pittsburgh was average against tight ends and average against running backs in the receiving game, which is another thing you see a lot of from Kansas City. So the Pittsburgh defense is interesting, but there's no doubt that the outcome has been very good. They've been a very good defense this year.
And they were particularly great against the Dolphins, like I mentioned. They shut down Jay Ajayi to the tune of 33 yards on 16 carries, which I guess sort of avenged his 200-yard game against them earlier in the year. You had already mentioned to me last week when I was asking about Ajayi that the Steelers had actually been very effective against the run this season. And I was going to ask you whether that's something that was like a particular problem for the Chiefs. I've always thought of the Chiefs as a team that's sort of driven by the running game, but I'm wondering if maybe that's not true this year. You were just talking about like how Hill had become this great offensive weapon for the team, how great of a player Kelce had become. Are the Chiefs more balanced towards passing than I originally thought?
Yeah, but I mean, even when they pass, it's mostly short stuff. I mean, Alex Smith throws longer than he has in the past, but he still throws mostly short. Tyreek Hill, it's a lot of yak. I think if you go back on Football Outsiders and you read the Any Given Sunday that Rivers McCown wrote about Tennessee's upset of Kansas City a few weeks ago, he talks about how the problem is that everything is keyed to the run game. And if they can't run, Kansas City doesn't quite know what they're doing on offense. And I think that's sort of true. Like, your offense can be built around the running game even if you're better passing than you are running, because it's about sort of how the defenses are playing you.
Yeah.
So I think that it's still true that Kansas City's offense is built around the run game. I mean, a lot of it now is also the threat of Tyreek Hill on end arounds and jet sweeps. But I think that they're going to need to run the ball. And Pittsburgh has been a good run defense this year, but not a great run defense. What's improved in the Pittsburgh defense over the second half of the year is against the pass, not against the run. The run defense DVOA is basically the same, but against the pass, they've gone from 17th in the first half of the season to 6th in the second half.
So I think the reason that this game is so appealing to me is that it pits two of only the very few balanced teams against each other this year. Only New England, Pittsburgh, Kansas City, and barely Baltimore and Tampa Bay were in the top half of both offense and defense in DVOA. So most of the teams, even in the playoffs, still are either heavily skewed towards offense or toward defense. One aspect of the game actually does have a clear favorite in this matchup, and it's on special teams as well, where the Chiefs are the number one special teams unit now, and the Steelers are just 21st. Do you think special teams might be something that sort of leans your opinion of who could win this game one way or the other?
Oh, sure, but especially because special teams, there's sort of two. Special teams has the consistency stuff, like kickoff distance and field goal percentage, and it has the big plays like missing field goals and like Tyreek Hill touchdowns.
Sure,
and no team in the playoffs is more likely to have a big special teams play than Kansas City with Tyreek Hill. But I think the other big issue here is just the massive inconsistency of the Pittsburgh Steelers this year, and the sort of feeling that you never know which Ben Roethlisberger is going to show up. He's been so inconsistent this year.
Yeah.
And I think some of that is sort of how they look for big plays. So Scott Kazmar sent me a little tidbit from the preview he's writing. The Steelers are dead last in the league in using play-action passes. But when they do use a play-action pass, Roethlisberger averages 13.5 air yards per attempt, which is the second highest in the league. So when they go play action, they go big. And of course, that leads to a lot of, it's a high risk, high reward strategy, which I think leads to some of the inconsistency. But you do have with the secondary of Kansas City, a secondary that does sort of specialize in interceptions. I tend to be a much bigger believer in coverage stats than in interceptions, because interceptions are, there's a lot of random variation in that. But I mean, there's no doubt that the way they play, they look to pick balls off. They look to jump routes. So I think you just have a really high variability in this game of what you're going to expect from the Pittsburgh offense. And between that and the variability of special teams, it's a hard game to predict.
Yeah, I mean, in both teams' cases, it seems like big plays could really decide this game.
This seems like the closest game of the weekend.
I agree.
And the Las Vegas oddmakers agree.
Completely agree. Okay, let's move on to the final game between the Packers and the Cowboys. It's probably the premier game, at least from a rating standpoint. After another strong showing in the wildcard round, the Packers have become the number one offensive DVOA team. Thinking back, over the first half of the season, it felt like they were really struggling, kind of culminating in that 4-game losing streak they had to Atlanta, Indianapolis, Tennessee, and Washington. They were actually at 4-6 at that point in the season and have won 7 straight games since then. In DVOA, have you noticed a dramatic improvement over the last 2 months, or were there maybe factors at play that led to the early struggles and the recent success, even though the play was more similar than I think we realized?
Yeah, I mean, they dipped the most at the middle of the season, more than first half, second half. But they were so strong over the last 6 weeks that there are clear trends.
Yeah.
Right? So through week 9, which is halfway through the losing streak, I think, 15th passing and 16th rushing. Week 10 to 17, number 2 passing, number 3 rushing. And that does not include last week's playoff performance, which was really, really great against the team that was the second best defense in the league by our numbers.
For sure.
And I mean, this is one of those, I think, issues where figuring out the why is more of a scouting thing than a stats thing. You know, stats often tell you what, and scouting tells you why. Scouting doesn't do a great job of telling you what because your mind only remembers certain plays. You don't remember everything that's happening, but scouting tells you a lot more about why. And if it's, you know, the receivers playing better, is it that the roots are not so stale? I mean, there certainly was a feeling in the first half of the year like, God, you knew what Green Bay was going to do all the time. Whether it's Rodgers playing better, I mean, Kean Fahey would like kick you in the nuts if you even suggested that Rodgers was not playing awesome at any point this year. But I do think that most observers do feel that he was not playing at his best in the first half of the year. Fundamentals, you know, obviously he could still do those things he does where Rodgers makes passes that no one else can make, escaping pockets, throwing across his body, but he wasn't the guy that he has been in the last few weeks. It's a combination of things, and some of it has to be on him.
Well, I'm wondering.
There's no doubt that they've been better,
and I'm wondering just how much of it really is on him specifically. I found this really interesting in your ESPN.com article from last week. You ranked every playoff team's position groups, so like which team has the best quarterback, which team has the best running back, etc. in the playoffs. And for Green Bay, you ranked their quarterback as being the best. Big shock. Then you ranked their running backs as being the 10th of the 12 playoff teams, and their wide receivers and tight ends also being 10th of the 12 teams. So it seems like their offensive success is really all about Rodgers. Is that pretty much true in your mind?
God, it's hard to figure out. Ranking the wide receiver tight ends was the hardest thing to do as part of that article because it was so difficult to separate quarterbacks from receivers, but also to judge teams with, like, you know, one spectacular receiver like Pittsburgh versus teams with sort of, you know,
distributed talent,
a whole group of guys. What we know is Jared Cook has always been a little bit of a disappointment. I know he's never lived up to his potential. Apparently Rodgers is fond of him, and he had a nice game last week. And he's definitely someone you want to look for this week because Dallas is 30th in defense against tight ends, but you know, he's never been the player that you thought he was going to be. Richard Rodgers is not that great. As far as the other positions, I mean, Geronimo Allison is just like some guy that they found. Devontae Adams is playing better this year than last year, but he still makes mistakes when he's trying to catch the ball. He doesn't seem like he gets open that easily. Randall Cobb is a player who's really great but limited in what he can do, but great at the things that he can do. So I do think a lot of it is about Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers as opposed to Richard.
Gotcha. I think pretty much everyone had that one figured out. The one skill position guy that I wonder might be key, and something that might make me a little bit nervous if I were a Packers fan, is with the Jordy Nelson injury. You know, in 2015, Aaron Rodgers had kind of a down year for him with just a 61% completion rate, 3,800 passing yards. Like, that's a lot worse than he normally does. That was the year that Jordy missed the entire season with a knee injury. And I think I remember talking to you on the podcast last year about the fact that even though we've always sort of thought about Rodgers as being able to do it with whatever kind of weird supporting cast he's had, maybe Jordy Nelson himself was like a really, really good player, and I think actually led the league in DYAR in 2014, for instance. Is he the critical offensive piece besides Rodgers, and is that something that if they are missing him this week because of his broken ribs, that could be a real problem for the team?
So it's kind of confusing because if he is so critical, then why did Green Bay struggle so much in the first 2/3 of the season when he was back? And yes, it takes time to recover from an ACL injury, but if it was connected to that, then you would think the Packers would have been really bad early on and then okay in the middle and then really good late. But instead, they were like good early on and then really bad in the middle and then really good late. But Nelson was still 3rd in DYAR this year and 9th in DVOA. I mean, there's no question. He is the best receiver on that team. And yes, they will miss him. I don't know how much, given the first half of the year, this year with Nelson back, I don't know if he is as important as we thought he was last year. But he definitely is the most important of the receivers. So they'll miss him.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the Cowboys. Because of Ezekiel Elliott, because of their offensive line, we're always singing the praises there. I think of the Cowboys as being like a heavy run-skewing team. Is that what you see in the pass versus run data for DVOA?
Well, no, because it's sort of like the whole idea there. The run opens the pass up, and they're also good pass blocking, and there's good receivers, and Dak Prescott played well. So, I mean, they were 2nd in offensive DVOA running and 3rd in offensive DVOA passing the ball. They do really well passing the ball, too. But it's built off the run. Like what we said about Kansas City, right? Like the offense is, as far as how you get your opposition to play defense, the whole offense keys off the running game as far as how defenses play them, even though they were very highly efficient passing the ball.
Right. I think I know the answer to the follow-up question I have then, but the Packers they're only number 24th in weighted DVOA on defense, so this is not a really great defensive team. Do they have the style or maybe the skewing towards the run to disrupt what Dallas wants to do?
Well, the thing is that the Green Bay defense, you would think so, but they didn't the first time, right? Yeah. So, the Green Bay defense against the run was absurdly good the first 5 weeks of the season. And then against Dallas, Elliott gets 157 yards on 5.6 per carry.
Yeah.
And the whole Green Bay run defense has, struggled in the second half of the year. They were 4th in run defense DVOA the first half of the year, 24th in the second half. So the run defense has fallen even more than the pass defense has fallen with all of those injuries that they have at the cornerback position. So I don't think they're particularly. I mean, that they've got a good run defense. It's better than the pass defense, but Elliott's beaten it once and probably can somewhat again. I don't think you'll get 5.6 yards per carry, but they're not keeping him to 2.6.
No, that's for sure. The game you're referencing was from Week 6, and Dallas went up to Green Bay and won 30-16. So it was a pretty dominant performance. And even beyond just Elliott, Prescott threw for 247 yards and 3 touchdowns. Do you think that game is telling us a lot about what we should expect in this game, or were there maybe other factors involved that led to such a big Dallas win?
Well, we always overestimate what an early matchup means to a late matchup when you have a playoff rematch like this, and obviously all 4 of this week's games are rematches. But I think what it kind of does tell us is that Elliott can run on the run defense.
Sure.
I think what it suggests is that they cannot shut down Elliott completely. And the Packers had 4 turnovers in that game, and they're not likely to have 4 turnovers in this game because they've only had 1 turnover in the 7-game winning streak or something.
Yeah.
But the thing is that 30-16. Look, you take away a couple of those turnovers for Green Bay, but you put that game in Dallas instead of Green Bay, and Dallas still wins. Not 30-16, but if you look at the quality of how they played in every other way, that game, Dallas played better. So, I mean, given that this game is a Dallas home game, I think Dallas is rightfully favored, even though the Green Bay offense has been so hot lately. And I think it's very likely to be a big shootout. It may not seem like a big shootout because if there's so much running from Dallas, it'll chew more clock and there'll be fewer drives. But, I mean, I would expect both of these offenses to have the advantage over both of these defenses.
I think regardless, it seems like at least 3 of these games look like they're going to be really good. And I'm really looking forward to that after last week was sort of a dud across the board. So,
it's going to be fun, though, waiting to see if Osweiler can backdoor cover a 16-point spread. Come on.
Osweiler looked pretty good last week. I'll just say that.
Backdoor cover, baby. That game is waiting for the Texans to score 2 touchdowns in the second half of the fourth quarter.
Could absolutely see that.
To lose by 15.
Gamblers take note. Okay, we've already spent a lot of time on all of this stuff, so we should probably wrap it up for this week. But thanks, everybody, for listening to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. Definitely do subscribe to it on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, because we'll have a few more of these as the NFL season comes to an end, unfortunately. Thanks so much for joining me this week, Aaron, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week.